It is my privilege to welcome the subsection of the beautiful community that is philosophically curious. And we're going to have a chat today in a way that will be a bit more geeky than a pub conversation, but in a way that won't be an academic conversation, about the role of the individual in history. How much are wars and revolutions and civilizational bits of growth and decline a product at the explanatory level of the intentional states of individuals? Or how far do we need to explain that stuff in reference to things that go beyond what is in the head of particular individuals and sort of touch on various social forces, social causes, the workings of institutions, the workings of certain moments of historical moment, the workings of certain economic forces, the workings of certain sociological conceptions and practice, blah, 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 blah. Before we get any further, a story that'll help us not take a wrong turn to begin with in this conversation. I lived, as many of you who follow my chats, in Tonga for a while, nearly 20 years ago. And at one point, I had a little CD player that got borrowed by a villager. And instead of giving it back to me, the villager gave it to somebody else who took it to another island. And I'm sure that wasn't the case, but I didn't see another CD player on my island group or a place to buy it. I wasn't on the main island group in Tonga, and so I didn't know how I could get a CD player. And I needed it, not just listen to classical music, but also because I was quite seriously ill. I was coming out of a very severe period of chronic illness. At the time, and I was in a lot of pain and bedbound much of the time. And so I needed the CD player for my various relaxational and meditational activities. But there was a gap between how I saw what happened and how the locals saw what happened. How I saw what happened was closer to quite a sharp delineation of what's private property and what's not. I thought, that's my CD player. You borrowed it, but then you gave it away. So you kind of sort of nicked my stuff. Come on, that's cheeky. The locals thought of it partly like that, just because you can't completely buy out of that conception in the modern world. But they partly thought of it in terms of, well, there was the CD player and there was Vlad in Vlad's house on the hill. And then the CD player went somewhere else and then it was there. And then it went to yet another place, and then that's where it was. So a more diluted conception of the boundaries of private property. And you can see that all over the place. People are giving each other stuff. Parents are not necessarily bringing up their own children. This business of this is mine and this is yours was not as sharply delineated in that culture. So what do you have in that situation? Well, you have a confrontation between two different conceptions, and one is clearly a more individualist one, and another is clearly a more collectivist one. This is not what we are talking about today. But it's so important to get that right, because as soon as you mention a term like individualism, many people's brain just jumps to talking about how collectivist or individualist, whatever that means, one might want one's society to be. That ain't the conversation, because that is a normative question about how a social order should be organized. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how the social order should be explained, however it is organized. That's to say, you might choose a more collectivist social order, normatively, to live in, but you might believe that the best way to explain what's going on in it is in terms of the intentional states of individuals and less in terms of various kinds of collective explanations. So we're talking about individualism versus something else, if you like, at the level of social explanation. That has got nothing to do with whether your society looks like Karl Marx or Ayn Rand put it together. So please, a differentiation between these two questions is important. And you all get this, but our brain just so naturally goes to normative questions when we talk about the individual versus the collective. That's not where we're going. We're going to explanation, right? Even if you terribly favored the psychology of the locals and were disparaging about my psychology, and you thought it was some kind of expression of ultimate late capitalist cultural decline, even if you favor the local psychology, that says nothing about what mode of explanation you would use to describe what happened there. Thank you for bearing with me. That was long. So let's get going with explanatory questions about individualism. And there can be two poles here. And they're both completely and utterly silly, but that's where we've got to start, because then it'll be easier to move to the middle. The first pole says that individuals decide everything. And the second pole says individuals decide nothing. And while both of these positions are absurd, I do think there is a sociological difference there, because the first position, that the individual decides nothing, I don't think is actually thought by anyone. Not really. That's to say, if we go out into the street, we would have to be out there for days and days and days before we met somebody who said, well, you know, when Susan got her cup of coffee and ground her coffee beans, well, actually, her intentional states are irrelevant to the question of what coffee she got, how she ground her beans, and in what mug she drank it. Well, that's absurd. It's absurd that Harry and Susanna and their intentional states are irrelevant when it comes to the transference of their kids from one school to another. So obviously, nobody really believes that. Individuals decide these things. But the other view, which says that individuals decide everything, that when we explain society, there is nothing else to refer to except just the intentional states of individuals, that view is actually held by some people. And one such group might be certain kinds of normative libertarians who also have a not necessarily conceptually connected, adjacent view of an epistemic kind that says, well, it's only individuals that really explain what goes on in society. And that's quite an absurd view, because even with singular decisions like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we can't possibly say that we can explain it simply in reference to the intentional states of Mr. Putin plus the Kovalchuk brothers plus Mr. Patrushev plus 6 or 7 others. We're going to have to talk about the modern world. We're going to have to talk about the Russian economy. We're going to have to talk about various debates about modernization and westernization. We're going to talk about conceptions of conflict and international stage. That is also going to yield much explanation for us on top of the individual's intentional states. So, if we agree that saying that individuals decide nothing and that they decide everything is silly, how can we begin exploring what's left in the middle in a constructive way? And I suggest that we look at one very interesting argument. And that argument is that individuals might decide quite a lot, but what they do not decide is the big stuff that happens in history. When it comes to the big stuff, wars, revolutions, recessions, individuals don't decide that. What would you need to think that? What would you need to reject? What would you need to accept? Right? If you're going to take the position that individuals might decide quite a bit, but the big stuff in history isn't really about individuals. Let's evaluate that by looking at 4 positions about, if you like, escalating levels of difference that individuals might make, and see at which point we come up with a proposition that is unacceptable to somebody who says that individuals make no difference in history. Here is the first proposition. The actions of individuals, their intentions, make a big difference. And I think here, somebody who is not in a silly way, but is seriously committed to the view that individuals don't make a difference in history, they can easily accept that statement. Because obviously, the actions and intentional states of Susanna are impactful when it comes to her choices of coffee and her choices of schools for her kids. And nobody is going to deny that, right? Let's move to the second proposition. The actions or intentional states of individuals can make a big difference, and a big difference on a big scale. So not just a big difference, because it could be a big difference in the life of a family or a big difference in the life of a community taken very narrowly. But now we're talking about making a big difference on a big scale. Surely that's unacceptable now to the person who says individuals don't make a difference in history. But I think it is acceptable to them. And it's acceptable to them because what's unacceptable to them is the third proposition here, and that adds another qualifier. And here we've got the idea that the actions and intentions of individuals make a big difference on a big scale in a distinctive way. So not just a big difference, but a big difference on a big scale, and a difference that's made in a distinctive way. Because you could say, well, what about Mr. Zelensky choosing to stay in the capital when the war began in 2022? Does that make a big difference? Well, obviously it does. But what the historian or theorist who claims that individuals don't make a real difference in history would then say, yes, Zelensky made a difference, but it wasn't distinctive. That's to say, another agent in his position would have roughly done all the same stuff. That's what they need to say. And they believe they can say that. And we'll look in a moment at why it's actually implausible to claim that. But before we do that, let's move to a fourth proposition. So we've had the first proposition, individuals make a big difference. Second proposition, they make a big difference on a big scale. Third proposition, they make a big difference on a big scale that is distinctive. And that's the point at which, if you like, the denier of the significant role of individuals in history has to come in and say, well, here I can't do it anymore. This distinctive part is unacceptable to me. But there's a fourth proposition, and it's this, that individuals make a big difference on a big scale in a distinctive way and in accordance with their intentions or what they want to see happen. Now, that proposition is obviously unacceptable to the denier of the significant role of individuals in history. But here I want to say that claim is so strong that it doesn't even need to be pushed far by somebody who wants to insist on the role of individuals in history. And that is because so often individuals make a big difference on a big scale in a distinctive way, but not entirely in accordance with what they wanted to see come about. They change the trajectory of history, but not necessarily in the way they wanted. Right? That's a very standard historical scenario where there's a very, very big difference, but it doesn't look to exactly match what the individual was trying to do. Some examples, because we've been very pedantic so far. Andropov. If Andropov had lived longer, he'd have had to do what Gorbachev did, which is begin dismantling much of the system. That's what the person claiming that individuals make no difference in history would need to argue. They'd also need to argue that if Al Gore won instead of Bush, that Al Gore would have necessarily started the Iraq War. They need to argue that if Dave Cameron went the British PM at a certain point, that somebody else would have called an EU referendum. And if we swap to another example, the picture gets even more disturbing for the person who wants to claim that individuals don't make a difference in history. Let's look at Shakespeare's plays, or Beethoven's piano sonatas, or Picasso's greatest paintings. The denier of the significance of the role of individuals in history would here have to claim one of two things. Either that these are not major events on a big scale, that these works are not major events on a big scale, or they are, but that doesn't matter because if Beethoven hadn't written his sonata, somebody else would have. If Shakespeare hadn't written his plays, somebody else would have. If Picasso hadn't painted La Danse and Demoiselle d'Avignon and Guernica, somebody else would have. Well, that's an absolutely preposterous thing to think, I suggest. But as is the thing that leads you to the conclusion that these were not major contributions on a large scale. They were on a large scale, and it is absurd to think that if Beethoven was trampled on by a cow at the age of 4, that somebody else would have written the Arietto of Opus 111. That just doesn't make sense. Putin made a very big difference when it comes to us making sense of why the war happened. Arguably, not a single member of Putin's Security Council would have started a full-scale war against Ukraine. Back to Zelensky. No. Many people in Zelensky's place would have left. But that's not to say there aren't examples the other way, where a degree of striking proactive action by a certain individual actually turns out to be relatively substitutable. So, for instance, when Boris Johnson, the ex-UK PM, was doing a song and dance about supporting Ukraine, roughly speaking, British foreign policy would have been the same. Whoever was Prime Minister in the Conservative Party or in Labour, perhaps with the exception of a politician called Jeremy Corbyn, who would have been very considerably co-opted anyway into the default position for UK foreign policy on Ukraine. But he wouldn't have been co-opted all the way, and there would have been some differences there. But what I'm saying is that basically it doesn't matter who the next Prime Minister of the UK is going to be. The policy on Ukraine will be roughly similar. Not necessarily good or proactive enough, but similar. An important question arises that we shouldn't sweat, and that is, what counts as big scale? Let's say you change the speed limits in your local area by getting on the local council, some local bit of government in the country that you live in. Is that an achievement on a big scale? Well, probably not. Is a conversation like this, if it's not on the Tiny Philosophy channel, if it's on the main channel where we have an audience historically across the war of 250,000 returning viewers. Is that major? Well, probably not. But what if it was 2.5 million? Not 250,000. Well, maybe not. But obviously, if you said 50 million, then that's clearly a big difference. So you see, at one point we get to a space where it's obvious that something is a major event, and that distinction between what is and what isn't, we don't have to sweat. Two qualifications now that are actually going to be acceptable, I think, to everybody reasonable in this debate. And that includes the person who, contrary to me, thinks that individuals make no significant difference in history. The first clarification is that intentional action is individual. Just is individual. And that means you can't entirely detach an account of collective action from an account of individual action. You can't just sever them completely. It doesn't mean that you get to reduce collective action to individual action, but you can't sever them altogether. But I'm not suggesting that the person who says individuals don't make a big difference in history wants to make this severance. So I'm not making that accusation. Another clarification is that when we're talking about the explanation at the level of individual intent running out, what we're talking about replacing it is social explanation, social cause explanation, the sort of stuff, the sort of materials that anthropology, comparative politics, sociology, political philosophy, the philosophy of the social sciences might deliver us. We're talking about other kinds of social explanation. We are not talking about naturalistic explanation, scientific explanation. That will not explain historical events, right? The debate about the role of the individual in history is not going to be settled by a conversation about the redistribution of microphysical states. So the contrast we're working with here is, if you like, social cause versus individual intent. So how much individualism should we accept if we agree so far to have at least preliminarily rejected the position that says individuals make no difference in history? Well, let me paint two principles here that are very important. The first is that social cause explanations, which don't proceed in terms of the individual, go very far. But how far? That itself is a matter of social explanation. That itself is a matter of the truth credentials of comparative politics, sociology, political philosophy, and so on. So that's the first thing we want to put down. We don't know how far social cause explanations go. By social cause, I just mean any kind of way of explaining an historical event that isn't to do with Barry thought this and did that, and then Harry did this and thought that. A second thing I want to put down is that however far explanations at the individual level or at the social cause level go, answers to questions about such things will be inherently interpretive and will never be universally accepted. Interpretation is about insight and experience. It's not a matter of making things up. So when I say that something is a matter of interpretation, I'm not saying that it's subjective or relative. I'm saying that there are better and worse answers, but these better and worse answers can't be proven, nor can they be delivered with such clarity and exactitude and universality and generalizability, you're going to blast any reasonable observer, reader, listener into sharing your perspective. And so here is the basic difference between the social sciences, which in this respect of universality, exactitude, generalizability, contrast with the natural sciences, right? In that respect, the social sciences aren't sciences at all. Let me give you now couple of pub level tips. When we think about all of this stuff, it's so important to not fall for a trap that makes you think that relationships between individuals can be a good model for relationships between individuals mediated by institutions they share. Right? There are going to be some things that are profoundly and importantly true about relations between individuals mediated by institutions they share that aren't going to apply in, if you like, direct personal relationships between individuals. And a second pub level nugget I have is that we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which it's part of a theory of change that relationships make a big difference. That human relationship is a big part of any decent theory of change. Having an intimate connection with somebody, especially if both of you have different kinds of power that is mutually useful, that kind of intimacy is of enormous consequence and to a great extent decides how much of the world works. But back to a refresh of everything we've done in this conversation. We clarify that we're talking about social explanation. We're not talking about normative questions of how individualistic or collectivist a society should be. Then we made a distinction between two absurdities. One that says individuals make no difference and the other that says that they make all the difference. And we came up with a more reasonable denial of the role of the individual, which is not a denial of the role of the individual per se, but a denial of the role of the individual in history writ large, if you like, right? Not the local speed limit change, but big, at least nation-wide moments of historical moment. And there we pointed out what proposition the person arguing that the individual makes no difference in the historical process needs to deny. And that's the proposition that the individual makes a big difference on a big scale. So far, still so good. That is distinctive, that somebody else in their place wouldn't have made. That's the proposition that the denier of the role of the individual in history needs to stand up against. And I pointed out with several examples, particularly the examples of Beethoven, Shakespeare, and Picasso, that leads one to conclusions so absurd that one's got to back out of them if one is going to remain convincing. This didn't do much than just put a little bit extra light in that room, but I hope this may have been of some use to some of you. Lots of love and talk very soon.